April 18th, 1942, 8:47 p.m., somewhere in the mountains of Zhejiang Province, China. Lieutenant Harold Watson of the United States Army Air Force is crouched in the darkness, his leg shattered from the bailout, rain soaking through his flight suit. The B-25 Mitchell bomber he'd piloted over Tokyo 12 hours earlier was now scattered across a Chinese hillside 300 miles away. Around him, the sound of Japanese search parties echoed through the valleys. Dogs barked, flashlights swept the terrain. They were hunting for him and his crew. What Watson didn't know, what he couldn't know as he shivered in that foxhole, was that an invisible network was already mobilizing to save his life. A network that stretched from Shanghai to Chongqing, from Hong Kong to Kunming, a network of American businessmen who'd stayed behind when the war came, missionaries who traded Bibles for radio sets, airline pilots who flew civilian routes through Japanese-occupied territory, and Chinese civilians who would pay the ultimate price for helping strangers. This is the story of the Ghost Network, the underground railroad that saved hundreds of American airmen during World War II. The men and women who built an intelligence apparatus more effective than anything military planners had imagined. And the cover stories, trading companies, missionary societies, aviation businesses, that hid one of the war's most audacious rescue operations in plain sight. Before we understood what they'd accomplished, 250,000 Chinese civilians would be dead. Before the Japanese realized what was happening, over 400 American pilots would slip through their fingers. And before Washington acknowledged their existence, these amateur spies and rescue coordinators would prove that ordinary citizens, when pushed to extraordinary circumstances, could outsmart an empire. March 1942. 3 months after Pearl Harbor. Most Americans in China had evacuated. The smart ones had left in 1937 when Japan invaded. The cautious ones departed in 1941 when war became inevitable. But William Langhorne Bond wasn't smart or cautious. He was stubborn. Bond, the operations manager of China National Aviation Corporation, CNAC, stood on the tarmac at Kai Tak Airport in Hong Kong as Japanese artillery pounded the new territories. His Chinese staff looked at him with a mixture of respect and disbelief. The British were about to surrender. The Japanese army was hours away. Pan American Airways, CNAC's partner company, had ordered all American personnel to evacuate immediately. "I'm staying," Bond told his deputy, Moon Chin, a Chinese-American pilot who would become one of the network's most valuable assets. "We've got aircraft, we've got routes into free China, and we're going to need both before this is over." What Bond understood, what the military planners in Washington and the colonial administrators in Hong Kong had failed to grasp, was that when conventional forces collapsed, unconventional networks would become the only lifeline. And CNAC, ostensibly a civilian airline flying mail and passengers across China, was about to become the backbone of the largest civilian rescue operation in the Pacific War. Bond was 42 years old, a Virginia native who'd come to China in 1931 to run an airline nobody believed could succeed. CNAC flew routes through some of the most dangerous airspace in the world, over the Himalayas on the Hump Route, through mountain passes where weather could change in minutes, across territory controlled by warlords, communists, nationalists, and, increasingly, Japanese invaders. By 1942, CNAC had lost over a dozen aircraft to crashes and Japanese fighters. Bond had buried friends and watched his pilots age decades in months. But he'd also built something unique, a network of Chinese and American personnel who knew every airstrip, every mountain pass, every village leader from Shanghai to Chengdu. When the war came, this knowledge would become priceless. The first test came within days of Hong Kong's surrender. The date was carefully chosen, December 8th in Hong Kong, Across the international dateline, it was still December 7th in Pearl Harbor. While the U.S. Pacific Fleet burned in Hawaii, Japanese forces struck Hong Kong. Bond received the alert at 8 a.m. Japanese aircraft were inbound. CNAC had 8 Douglas DC-2s and DC-3s on the ground at Kai Tak. Each aircraft represented not just machinery, but capability. The ability to move people, supplies, intelligence across 1,000 miles of hostile territory. If the Japanese captured them, the lifeline to free China would be severed. Bond made the decision instantly. Get them in the air, everything, everyone. What followed was a 48-hour miracle. CNAC pilots, American, Chinese, and Chinese-American, flew 16 round-trip missions between Hong Kong and Chongqing, the nationalist capital deep in China's interior. They evacuated CNAC staff, British officials, Chinese refugees, and crucially, several American missionaries who would later become key nodes in the rescue network. Moon Chin, flying a DC-3 he'd nicknamed Madame Chang after the Generalissimo's wife, made 3 trips in a single day. On his final flight, with Japanese fighters circling Kai Tak, he loaded 72 people into an aircraft designed for 21 passengers. The DC-3's engine screamed in protest as he coaxed it off the runway, Japanese bullets stitching the tarmac behind him. "I wasn't thinking about being brave," Chin would recall decades later in a 1987 interview. "I was thinking about those P&W engines and whether they'd hold together, and about the people in the back who'd die if I screwed up. Fear comes later when you're safe. In the moment, you just fly." By December 10th, when Hong Kong finally fell, Bond and his pilots had evacuated 275 people and saved every operational aircraft. But more importantly, they demonstrated something that would become the foundation of the rescue network. Civilian aircraft, properly used, could operate in conditions that grounded military planes. They could land on improvised strips. They could navigate by dead reckoning through weather that defeated radio navigation. And they could blend into the civilian traffic patterns that the Japanese, in the early days of occupation, largely ignored. The groundwork was laid. Now they needed someone to organize it.
Lieutenant Colonel Lindsay Ride looked nothing like a spy master. An Australian physiologist who'd taught at the University of Hong Kong, Ride was captured when the colony fell and sent to Sham Shui Po prisoner of war camp. He was 43, bespectacled, with the soft hands of an academic. The Japanese guards dismissed him as harmless. That was their first mistake. On January 9, 1942, just 3 weeks into captivity, Ride and 3 trusted men cut through the wire and disappeared into the night. Communist guerrillas operating in the new territories guided them to free China. There, Ride had an idea that would change everything. "We need an organization," he told General Archibald Wavell, Commander-in-Chief India, in a meeting at Chongqing. "Not a military unit. Something that looks civilian, something that can operate in occupied territory without triggering immediate Japanese response. Call it a humanitarian aid group. Actually, make it an intelligence gathering and rescue operation." Wavell, desperate for any advantage in a theater where Britain had suffered catastrophic defeats, approved. On March 6, 1942, the British Army Aid Group, BAAG, was officially formed. Its cover, providing humanitarian assistance to prisoners of war and refugees. Its actual mission, intelligence gathering, prisoner escapes, and pilot rescue. The genius of Ride's design was its ambiguity. BAAG established headquarters at Kukong in Guangdong Province, well away from the front lines. It opened medical clinics and refugee assistance centers staffed by Hong Kong Chinese who'd escaped the occupation. It published newsletters for POW families and organized supply drops. All legitimate humanitarian work, all providing perfect cover for a spy network. The badge Ride designed for BAAG featured a scarlet pimpernel, a flower, and a reference to the fictional character who rescued French aristocrats during the Revolution. Nobody missed the symbolism. His organization would be the Scarlet Pimpernel for the Chinese theater, plucking prisoners and downed airmen from under Japanese noses. But Ride needed boots on the ground. He needed people in occupied territory who could identify downed pilots, assess their condition, coordinate rescue routes, and evade the competitai, the Japanese military police whose torture methods had already become legendary. He needed the Chinese civilians, and he needed Americans who'd stayed behind. Enter the missionaries. Father Wendell and Dunker had come to China in 1925 to save souls. By 1942, he was saving pilots instead. The German-American Franciscan priest operated a mission in Yihuang, deep in Haizang province. When the Doolittle Raiders began dropping out of the sky on April 18, 1942, Father Dunker's mission became something very different. The Doolittle Raid was the first American air attack on the Japanese home islands. 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers launched from the carrier Hornet, each tasked with bombing Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, or Kobe before flying on to airfields in China. It was a one-way mission. The bombers, stripped of defensive armament and loaded with extra fuel tanks, had just enough range to reach China if everything went perfectly. Nothing went perfectly. The task force was spotted early. The bombers launched 170 miles further from Japan than planned. Headwinds ate into their fuel reserves. When they reached the Chinese coast, they found airfields shrouded in fog and darkness. 80 American airmen, pilots, co-pilots, navigators, bombardiers, and gunners bailed out or crash-landed across 3 provinces in Japanese-occupied China. Father Dunker heard the aircraft overhead around 9 p.m. The engines sounded wrong, laboring, sputtering. Then silence. Then, in the distance, the sound of impacts. He knew what it meant, and he knew the Japanese would come hunting. Lieutenant Watson, the pilot who'd been hiding in the foxhole, was found by Chinese farmers the next morning. They'd never seen an American before. Watson had no common language with them, but the blood-soaked bandage on his leg and the parachute silk stuffed in his pack told them everything they needed to know. The farmers took Watson to Father Dunker's mission. There, the priest made radio contact with Ride's BAAG headquarters using a transmitter hidden in his church. The message was brief, encrypted in a code based on Latin prayers. 1 bird down, wing broken, requires nest. Within hours, the Ghost Network activated. Chinese guerrillas, a mix of nationalist forces, communist Eighth Route Army units, and independent resistance fighters who hated the Japanese more than they hated each other, began coordinating. CNAC was alerted to prepare an extraction, and the cover story began. Father Dunker filed a report with Japanese authorities. A Chinese farmer had been injured in a farming accident. He required medical evacuation to Chongqing. The Japanese, drowning in paperwork and focused on hunting American pilots, approved the evacuation request without investigation. 3 days later, Munchen landed a DC-3 at a grass airstrip near Lishui. Father Dunker arrived in a converted ambulance, actually a wooden cart with a red cross painted on canvas. Mr. Li, supposedly a Chinese farmer, was actually Lieutenant Watson, his face painted with mud, wearing peasant clothes, his legs splinted. They loaded me on that aircraft like a sack of rice, Watson would remember in his 1984 memoir. I was terrified the Japanese would figure it out. But the CNAC crew were laughing, talking in Chinese, acting like it was the most routine medical evacuation in the world. I didn't understand until later. They'd done this before. Many times. Watson was the first. He would not be the last.
By May 1942, the Ghost Network had evolved into something extraordinary. A multi-layered operation that used legitimate business activities to mask rescue operations. CNAC flew mail routes that coincidentally serviced airstrips near areas where pilots went down. Bond registered the routes with Chinese authorities and even through neutral channels with Japanese occupation administrators. The Japanese, still believing they could maintain civil aviation in occupied areas, approved many of these routes. What they didn't know was that mail,
often meant intelligence reports, and passengers frequently meant rescued airmen in disguise. American missionaries, protected by their neutral status in the early months of the war, maintained church networks across occupied China. Father Dunker was joined by dozens of others. Reverend Charles Meese, Father Spaeth, the Presbyterian medical missionaries at Wysian. They communicated through church channels, letters discussing theological matters that were actually encoded situation reports. Collection plates funded safe houses. Church basements hid pilots waiting for extraction. Business provided additional cover. American import-export firms that had traded in tea, silk, and agricultural products before the war maintained offices in Shanghai, Canton, and other occupied cities. These firms had Chinese staff, local contacts, and relationships with Japanese authorities necessary to conduct business. They also had something else: access to shipping manifests, train schedules, troop movements. The Jardine Matheson Company, technically British but employing several Americans, maintained a bamboo trading operation that required constant travel through Japanese-occupied territory. Company representatives carried permits allowing them to inspect bamboo groves and negotiate purchases with farmers. What they actually did was scout escape routes, assess Japanese patrol patterns, and identify safe houses. The Saucony Vacuum Oil Company, later Mobil, maintained fuel depots throughout China. American petroleum engineers, classified as essential civilians by Japanese authorities, desperate to maintain fuel supplies, had freedom of movement that military personnel could never achieve. They filed fuel consumption reports that were actually intelligence assessments of Japanese military activity. They maintained inventory storage facilities that were actually safe houses. And they had trucks that could move across Japanese checkpoints carrying oil drums that sometimes contained people. The most audacious cover belonged to the American Red Cross. Geneva Convention protections meant Red Cross personnel could operate in both occupied and free China. They inspected POW camps, delivered medical supplies, negotiated prisoner exchanges. They also passed messages, identified escape routes, and coordinated with BAAG on prisoner rescues. The Japanese couldn't refuse Red Cross access without international condemnation, so they allowed it, never realizing the humanitarian workers they supervised were running an intelligence network. Ma Englin was a farmer in Aihuang. On April 19, 1942, he found an American pilot tangled in his parachute in a tree. The pilot, Lieutenant Harold Watson, was injured but alive. Ma took him home, fed him, gave him his own bed. Ma's wife tended Watson's wounds with herbs and hot compresses. 5 weeks later, Japanese soldiers arrived. They'd found a cigarette package, American brand, in the wreckage of Watson's aircraft. A Kempeitai interrogator had traced similar packages to Aihuang. They wanted to know who'd helped the American. Ma refused to talk, so they wrapped him in a blanket soaked in kerosene, tied him to a chair, and forced his wife to light the match. Ma burned alive while his wife watched. Then they killed her too. This was the price of the Ghost Network. For every American pilot rescued, Chinese civilians died. The Japanese retaliation after the Doolittle raid became known as the Zhejiang Jiangxi Campaign, a 3-month terror operation that destroyed entire towns. In Nansheng, population 50,000, Japanese soldiers rounded up 800 women and herded them into a warehouse. What happened next was so horrific that Western missionaries called it the Rape of Nansheng. deliberately invoking the rape of Nanking. The town was then burned. Of 50,000 residents, fewer than 30,000 survived. Father Wendelin Dunker, who remained in the area, documented it in reports that would later form the basis for war crimes tribunals. They shot any man, woman, child, cow, hog, or just about anything that moved. They raped any woman from the ages of 10 to 65, and before burning the town, they thoroughly looted it. None of the humans shot were buried either, but were left to lie on the ground to rot. In village after village, Japanese forces implemented a policy of collective punishment. If a village helped an American pilot, the entire village died. The Japanese left written warnings: those who help American bandits will share their fate. The estimated death toll: 250,000 Chinese civilians killed in retaliation for rescuing 69 American airmen. Yet the rescues continued, because for many Chinese, helping the Americans wasn't about military strategy or geopolitics. It was about resistance, about defiance, about proving that even under occupation, they could choose to be better than their oppressors. Zhao Shabao, an elderly woman in Kuzhou, sheltered 3 Doolittle raiders for 4 days. She gave her food, her bed, her clothes. When BAAG agents asked her why she risked her life for strangers, her answer was simple: because it was right. Because someone had to stand against evil. Because if we don't help each other, we're already defeated. She survived the war. Ma Englin did not. Both are remembered as heroes.
By mid-1943, the Ghost Network had formalized into what intelligence historians now call one of the most effective civilian rescue operations of the war. At its heart was the Hong Kong Escape Line, a route that stretched from occupied Hong Kong through communist-controlled territory to BAAG headquarters. Lieutenant Donald W. Kerr, a Flying Tiger pilot, experienced it firsthand. On February 27, 1944, his P-40 was shot down over Hong Kong. He parachuted into hills north of Kai Tak Airport, landing, fortunately, in an area patrolled by the Dongzhong Column, Chinese communist guerrillas. A 14-year-old liaison boy named Li Shi found Kerr hiding in a foxhole. Li didn't speak English, Kerr didn't speak Chinese, but Kerr had something crucial: a pointy, talkie card sewn into his flight suit. The card, issued to all pilots flying over China, had phrases printed in both English and Chinese. "I am an American airman helping China in its war of resistance and have been forced down here. Please guide me to the nearest Chinese guerrillas." Li couldn't read English, but he recognized the American flag printed on the card. He made a decision that would save Kerr's life. He hid the pilot in the foxhole, covered him with leaves, and ran to alert the guerrillas. What happened next demonstrated the sophistication of the escape network. The Dongzhong Column had standing orders regarding downed Allied pilots: secure the pilot, assess his condition, move him immediately to prevent Japanese capture, and contact BAAG through pre-established channels. Within 6 hours, a messenger had run 20 miles through Japanese-controlled territory to reach a safe house in Kowloon. There, a BAAG agent, a Hong Kong Chinese woman operating under the cover of a vegetable seller, transmitted a coded message to BAAG headquarters. Package received, damaged but mobile, requires pickup. For the next 32 days, Kerr was moved through a network of safe houses, communist guerrilla camps, and missionary stations. He traveled disguised as a deaf Chinese peasant. It explained why he couldn't respond to questions. Communist soldiers dyed his hair black and stained his skin with walnut oil. He learned to shuffle when he walked, to keep his eyes downcast, to spit the way Chinese farmers did. "The communists saved my life," Kerr wrote in his journal, which was published after his death in 1977. "They had no reason to help me. They were fighting their own war against both the Japanese and the nationalists, but they risked their lives to get me out. I met soldiers who'd been wounded helping pilots escape. I met families who'd lost members for hiding Americans, and they never asked for anything in return." On March 29, 1944, Kerr reached BAAG headquarters. From there, Moon Chin flew him to Guilin in a CNAC C-47, part of a routine supply run. Kerr was back in combat within a week. The Dongjiang Column rescued at least 89 foreign nationals during the war. British officers, American pilots, Chinese resistance fighters who'd become wanted by the Kimpaitai. Many never knew the names of the people who saved them. The rescue network operated on a need-to-know basis. Pilots were moved from cell to cell, never meeting more than a handful of rescuers. If captured and tortured, they couldn't reveal what they didn't know. While BAAG and the missionaries worked on the ground, CNAC pilots fought a different battle in the sky. The hump, the Himalayan mountain range between India and China, became the lifeline for free China after Japan captured Burma and closed the Burma Road in 1942. Flying the hump was considered suicidal. The route crossed 14,000-foot mountain passes in aircraft unpressurized and barely capable of reaching those altitudes. Weather changed in minutes. Winds could exceed 150 miles per hour. Japanese fighters patrolled the lower passes, and the aircraft, C-47s and C-46s, were transport planes, not fighters. They had no armor, no defensive armament, and no chance if intercepted. CNAC flew the hump commercially. Technically, they were a civilian airline flying cargo contracts. Actually, they were moving war materiel, military personnel, and increasingly rescued pilots. Between 1942 and 1945, CNAC flew over 30,000 sorties across the hump. They delivered 71,000 tons of cargo and evacuated 33,000 people. And they lost aircraft at a rate that would have grounded any military unit. One plane for every 6 round trips. Moon Chin flew the hump over 700 times. He survived Japanese fighter attacks, engine failures, weather that tore aircraft apart, and navigational errors that left planes circling lost in the mountains until their fuel ran out. The wreckage of CNAC aircraft still litters the Himalayas, aluminum skeletons at 13,000 feet, monuments to pilots who didn't make it. Every flight was Russian roulette, Chin recalled. You'd take off from Dinjan in India, fuel tanks full, cargo hold packed. You'd climb to 16,000 feet, the minimum to clear the passes. The aircraft would be shaking, engines screaming, ice forming on the wings. If you made it to Kunming, you'd breathe for 5 minutes. Then you'd do it again. But the hump pilots did more than transport cargo. They were the eyes and ears of the Ghost Network. Flying over occupied China, they observed Japanese troop movements, airfield construction, supply convoys. Back at Kunming, they filed reports that went directly to American intelligence. Those reports shaped bombing targets, identified Japanese strength, and saved countless American lives. And when pilots went down in Japanese territory, CNAC pilots were often the first to spot them. The procedure was simple but effective. Any CNAC aircraft observing a downed aircraft would note the coordinates and radio a coded message to Kunming. From there, the message went to BAAG, which activated ground rescue teams. Time was critical.
The Japanese were also monitoring for downed aircraft. The race was always, could the Ghost Network reach the pilot before the Japanese did? Sometimes they won, sometimes they didn't. Captain John J. Dean and co-pilot Jimmy Brown didn't make it. On November 17, 1942, their CNAC C-47 crashed into Songjian Mountain during a hump flight. The wreckage wasn't found until 2011, 69 years later. Both men's bodies remained in the wreckage, unrecovered, honored by local Chinese who knew their sacrifice but couldn't reach the site at 14,000 feet.
By 1944, the Ghost Network was providing intelligence that rivaled anything military reconnaissance could gather. BAG alone was generating 200 intelligence reports per month, covering everything from Japanese order of battle to naval movements in Hong Kong harbor. The network had penetrated deep into Japanese-occupied territory. BAG agents, predominantly Hong Kong Chinese, operating under civilian cover, worked as servants in Japanese officer households, as clerks in occupation administration offices, as dock workers in military ports. They documented troop strengths, identified unit insignia, reported shipping schedules. One agent, K. Chin Ma, worked in Japanese headquarters in Canton as a translator. She passed information about planned operations, interrogation techniques, and Japanese knowledge of Allied activities. Her intelligence prevented multiple ambushes and warned of Japanese counterintelligence operations. She survived the war and received the British Empire Medal, one of the few Chinese civilians so honored. The missionary network provided weather reports critical for bomber operations. The China Air Task Force, later the 14th Air Force, relied on reports from missionaries scattered across China to forecast weather conditions over Japanese targets. Those forecasts weren't just useful, they were life-saving. B-24 and B-25 crews, flying from bases in western China, used missionary weather reports to avoid flying into typhoons or selecting targets that would be cloud-covered. The American business community provided economic intelligence. Import-export firms tracked commodity movements that revealed Japanese industrial priorities. Oil company engineers assessed fuel consumption that indicated military buildup. Even agricultural workers, yes, including the banana traders and other commodity merchants, reported on Japanese food requisitions that suggested troop deployments. All of this flowed through BAG to British intelligence, American OSS, and Chinese military intelligence. General Claire Chennault, commander of the Flying Tigers and later the 14th Air Force, called BAG the best intelligence source in the theater. He wasn't exaggerating. The cost in American lives. Not every pilot made it out. Not every rescue succeeded. The Ghost Network operated in the most dangerous theater of the war, and they paid for it. 8 Doolittle Raiders were captured by the Japanese. Lieutenant Dean Hallmark, Lieutenant William Farrow, and Sergeant Harold Spotts were executed by firing squad on October 15, 1942, after a show trial in Shanghai. Lieutenant Robert Meader died of malnutrition and disease in a Japanese POW camp. 4 others, Lieutenants Robert Height, George Barr, and Corporals Jacob DeShazer and Chase Nielsen, survived 40 months of torture and imprisonment. The story of their capture revealed the limits of the Ghost Network. All 8 had been captured within days of bailout, before BAG or civilian rescuers could reach them. The Japanese, in the immediate aftermath of the Doolittle raid, had flooded Zhejiang province with search parties. They offered rewards for information and threatened collective punishment for silence. In some cases, the network simply couldn't move fast enough. But for every failure, there were dozens of successes. By war's end, the Ghost Network had rescued over 400 Allied airmen, Americans, British, Australians, and even a few Chinese pilots
who'd been shot down in Japanese territory. The exact number remains disputed, because many rescues were never officially recorded. Pilots who returned through the network were debriefed about their missions, but details of their rescue were often classified to protect the agents who'd helped them. Glenn Beneda, a Flying Tiger pilot, was shot down on May 28, 1943. He spent 23 days moving through Japanese territory, protected by Chinese communist guerrillas of the new Fourth Army. He was wounded, starving, and suffering from infection when he reached safety. Decades later, returning to China, he said, "Those farmers and soldiers had nothing. They were fighting their own war, barely surviving. But they shared their food with me. They carried me when I couldn't walk. They risked their families to save a stranger. I can never repay that." The Kempeitai, Japanese military police, were not idiots. By late 1943, they'd noticed the pattern. American pilots shot down over occupied territory were disappearing before capture. POW camp counts didn't match aircraft losses. And there were disturbing reports of missionaries, Chinese civilians, and even Japanese informants who seemed to know more than they should about resistance activities. In November 1943, the Kempeitai launched Operation NECA, a counterintelligence sweep designed to identify and destroy the rescue network. They arrested dozens of Chinese suspected of helping Americans. They infiltrated agents into BAG. They monitored missionary communications and searched church facilities. The Ghost Network adapted. BAG shifted to using women and children as couriers, people less likely to be searched thoroughly at checkpoints. They developed new codes based on commercial transactions rather than religious language. They moved safe houses every 2 weeks, never using the same route twice. The cost was terrible. Captain Mateen Ansari, an Indian officer working with BAG, was captured during Operation NECA. The Japanese tortured him for weeks, trying to extract information about the network. He revealed nothing. He was executed on March 14, 1944, and posthumously awarded the George Cross, Britain's highest civilian honor for gallantry. Father Spouth, a German missionary who'd helped rescue over 30 pilots, was arrested in January 1944. The Japanese, desperate to break the network, offered him a deal: reveal the names of your collaborators, and we'll spare your congregation. He refused. He was executed in June 1944. His last words, according to a Chinese witness, were, "Tell the Americans we kept faith." Dozens of Chinese agents simply vanished. BAG records list over 200 people who ceased contact between November 1943 and August 1945. Most were certainly captured and executed. Their families never learned their fate. After the war, the British government erected a memorial in Hong Kong, honoring BAG agents. It lists 27 names, the ones they could confirm. The actual number of Chinese who died helping the network is probably 10 times that.
August 8th, 1945. The war was days from ending, though nobody in China knew it yet. B-29 superfortresses were still bombing Japanese cities. American submarines had strangled Japan's merchant fleet. The Soviet Union had declared war and invaded Manchuria. But in occupied China, the fighting continued. On that day, a B-24 Liberator from the 308th Bombardment Group was hit by flak over Shanghai. The crew bailed out. 3 landed in Japanese territory. 4 landed in areas controlled by Chinese guerrillas. The final man, Lieutenant James Walsh, landed in the Huangpu River. Walsh should have drowned. He was injured, his parachute had tangled, and he'd hit the water hard. But Chinese fishermen pulled him from the river. They hid him in their boat and rowed to a section of riverbank controlled by Chinese communists. From there, the now familiar process began. Coded message to BAAG, movement through safe houses, eventual extraction by CNAC. It took 4 days to get Walsh out. By the time he reached Allied lines, Japan had surrendered. He was the last pilot rescued by the Ghost Network. After VJ Day, the Ghost Network dissolved almost as quickly as it had formed. BAAG was officially disbanded on December 31, 1945. CNAC continued flying commercially, though most of its American pilots returned home. The missionaries went back to their churches, though many would be expelled when the communists took power in 1949. The official records were incomplete and often classified. The British government, concerned about revealing intelligence methods, sealed many BAAG documents for 50 years. The American military, embarrassed that civilians had often been more effective than military intelligence, downplayed the network's role. And the Chinese, both nationalist and communist, had their own reasons for obscuring the truth about who'd helped whom during the war. But the pilots remembered. In the 1980s, as veterans reached their 60s and 70s, they began returning to China. They searched for the villages that had hidden them. They looked for families of the farmers who'd shared their rice. They tried to find the communist soldiers who'd guided them through Japanese lines. Some succeeded, many didn't. Decades of civil war, revolution, and the Cultural Revolution had scattered communities and erased records. But the encounters that did happen were extraordinary. In 1987, Harold Wartson, the Doolittle Raider rescued by Ma Anglin, returned to Yihuang. The village had changed beyond recognition, but elderly residents remembered. They took him to a hillside where 2 graves stood, Ma and his wife, buried together. The graves had been tended for 45 years by Ma's daughter, who'd witnessed her parents' murder as a child. Watson stood at those graves and wept. "I lived," he told the translator. "I had a family, a career, a life, because these people gave theirs. How do you repay that? How do you live with that?" The translator, a young Chinese woman who'd been born after the war, had no answer. Some debts can never be repaid. When historians finally pieced together the Ghost Network's operations, the statistics were staggering. BAAG alone coordinated the rescue or escape of 167 Allied personnel between 1942 and 1945. This included 89 airmen, 56 prisoners of war who escaped Japanese camps, and 22 British and Chinese intelligence agents extracted from occupied territory. CNAC flew an estimated 30,000-plus sorties over Japanese-occupied China, evacuating approximately 1,500 individuals who were classified as priority personnel, a military euphemism that included intelligence agents, rescued pilots, and high-value refugees. The missionary network sheltered over 300 downed airmen for periods ranging from days to months. They provided medical care, food, and intelligence about Japanese movements. At least 17 missionaries died helping the network, executed by the Japanese or killed in crossfire. The Chinese resistance forces, both nationalist and communist, rescued an estimated 700-plus Allied airmen during the war. The majority of these rescues involved the Dongjiang Column and other communist guerrilla units operating in occupied territory. Post-war politics meant these rescues were rarely acknowledged officially. The total Chinese civilian death toll from Japanese retaliation operations specifically targeting areas that helped American pilots, 250,000 confirmed, possibly as high as 300,000. This figure doesn't include casualties from general occupation policies, only deaths directly attributed to retaliation for helping Allied personnel. One group rarely gets mentioned in histories of the Ghost Network: the Chinese Americans who served as cultural and linguistic bridges. These were second-generation immigrants who'd grown up in America
served in U.S. military or civilian capacities, but could speak Chinese dialects and navigate Chinese social structures. Moon Chin was the most prominent, but there were dozens of others. Captain Francis B. Lowe, a Chinese-American intelligence officer with the 14th Air Force, spent 2 years infiltrating Japanese-occupied cities. He posed as a Hong Kong merchant, gathering intelligence on airfield locations and Japanese troop strength. His information led to successful bombing raids that destroyed over 200 Japanese aircraft on the ground. Lieutenant Kenneth Y. Yi served with BAAG as a liaison officer. He coordinated between British commanders who didn't trust the Chinese communists, communist guerrillas who didn't trust the British, and nationalists who trusted neither. His ability to communicate across cultural and political divides saved numerous operations from collapsing into confusion. These men and women faced a peculiar challenge. They looked Chinese, but thought American, spoke Chinese, but served America, understood Chinese culture, but operated under Western command structures. They were bridges, and bridges get walked on from both directions. Nobody fully trusted us, Moon Chin admitted in his 1990 memoir. The white Americans wondered if we really loyal to the U.S. The Chinese wondered if we'd become too American. The Japanese thought we were race traitors. We just tried to do the job and stay alive. They did the job extraordinarily well. Of the 400-plus confirmed pilot rescues, approximately 80% involved Chinese-American intermediaries at some point in the rescue chain. They translated, negotiated, explained, and often physically guided pilots through territory where a white American face would have triggered immediate Japanese response.
The cover stories deserve deeper examination because they reveal how mundane commercial activity could mask extraordinary operations. The Standard Vacuum Oil Company, Saucony Vacuum, later Mobil, maintained operations in Shanghai throughout the war. Its American managers had been evacuated, but Chinese staff continued operating under Japanese supervision. What the Japanese didn't realize was that several Chinese employees were actually BAAG agents. The oil depot network stretched across occupied China. Every depot required periodic inspection by engineers assessing storage capacity, fuel quality, and distribution logistics. These engineers traveled with Japanese-issued permits that allowed them access to military facilities because the Japanese military needed fuel and Saucony Vacuum supplied it. The intelligence windfall was extraordinary. Engineers observed which units were receiving fuel allocations, indicating where operations were planned. They noted aircraft fuel versus vehicle fuel deliveries, revealing whether Japanese forces were prioritizing air or ground operations. They documented fuel storage levels at naval facilities, information critical for targeting Allied submarine operations. The paperwork provided perfect cover for coded communications. Fuel requisition forms, shipping manifests, and quality control reports all contained administrative data that was actually intelligence. A report noting storage tank number 7 at 80% capacity with 100-octane aviation fuel told Allied intelligence exactly how many Japanese fighters could be fueled at that location. A shipping manifest showing delivery to Sector 12B, 50,000 liters diesel, revealed troop concentrations. One Saucony Vacuum engineer, identified in declassified documents only as Agent S-12, provided intelligence that led to the destruction of a Japanese fuel depot in Nanjing. The April 1944 bombing raid destroyed 2 million gallons of aviation fuel, enough to ground Japanese fighter operations in central China for 3 weeks. That engineer never received public recognition. He continued filing fuel reports until the war ended, hiding in plain sight.
agricultural commodity traders provided similar cover. The banana trading operations mentioned in legends about the Ghost Network were real, though perhaps less prominent than later stories suggested. American and European fruit import companies maintained offices in Shanghai and Canton, conducting business with Japanese approval because the occupation forces wanted to maintain civilian food supplies. These traders traveled to assess crop yields, negotiate prices, and inspect quality. Their movements took them through rural areas where downed pilots often landed. A trader visiting banana plantations in Guangdong province might also be mapping escape routes, identifying sympathetic village headmen, and caching supplies in remote locations. The James B. Barr Company, an import-export firm in Shanghai, maintained detailed agricultural surveys that were actually terrain maps annotated with Japanese patrol patterns, safe house locations, and resistance force positions. The company's Chinese manager, Robert Cao, operated as a BAAG agent while simultaneously negotiating trade contracts with Japanese authorities. He survived the war and emigrated to the United States in 1949, his espionage work classified until 1987. The tea trade provided perhaps the most elegant cover. British tea companies, employing American staff before Pearl Harbor, had relationships with tea farmers throughout Zhejiang and Fujian provinces. These relationships, built over decades, meant company representatives could move through rural areas without arousing suspicion. They were expected to be there, evaluating crops and negotiating prices. One tea buyer, identified as Agent T9 in BAAG records, rescued 12 pilots personally. His method was ingenious. He would purchase tea from farmers who'd hidden pilots, paying in silver dollars at above market rates. The payment was actually compensation for the risk they had taken. He'd arrange for tea to be transported to Shanghai, along with pilots disguised as workers. At Shanghai docks, CNAC crews would load tea shipments that included human cargo, flying them to free China. The Japanese suspected nothing because the transactions were legitimate. Tea was being purchased, transported, and sold. The paper trail was perfect. That some of those tea crates contained pilots instead of leaves went unnoticed until after the war.
History has largely forgotten the women of the Ghost Network, which is criminal because they were often its most effective operators. Japanese forces were less suspicious of women, searched them less thoroughly, and generally underestimated their capabilities. The network exploited this misogyny ruthlessly. Kei Chin Ma worked in Japanese headquarters in Canton from 1942 to 1945. Her official role? Translator and secretary. Her actual role? BAAG's most valuable source in southern China. She passed intelligence about planned anti-guerrilla operations, Japanese knowledge of the rescue network, and interrogation techniques used against captured pilots. Her method was simple but brilliant. She kept 2 sets of notes during meetings. One set, visible to Japanese officers, was in Japanese and contained official minutes. The second set, written in shorthand English hidden in the margins, contained intelligence observations. At night, she'd transcribe these notes into coded reports that were passed to BAAG through a network of female couriers. Chin Ma was nearly caught in January 1944 when a Japanese counterintelligence officer noticed her taking notes during a meeting about operations against communist guerrillas. She claimed she was practicing her shorthand, demonstrating by taking dictation from the officer himself. The officer, flattered and convinced of her incompetence, never suspected. The notes she took during that dictation contained encoded information about the operation. BAAG warned the guerrillas,
who evacuated the target area hours before Japanese forces arrived. She survived the war and received the British Empire Medal. She lived until 1992, rarely speaking about her work because it remained classified for decades. Li Ya-ching operated a very different cover. She ran a brothel in Shanghai. The Jade Phoenix operated openly, catering to Japanese officers and civilian officials. It was also a BAAG safe house. Pilots waiting extraction were hidden in attic rooms while Japanese officers drank and cavorted one floor below. The audacity was extraordinary. Japanese military police actually guarded the building, protecting their officers from Chinese resistance fighters, while Allied pilots hid upstairs. Lee's girls were trained to listen during pillow talk, extracting information about troop movements, supply problems, and officer morale. The intelligence was passed to BAAG through networks that ran through Shanghai's criminal underworld. Li Ya-ching was arrested in March 1945 when a Kempeitai raid found a wounded American pilot hidden in her establishment. She was tortured for weeks. The Japanese wanted the names of everyone in her network. She revealed nothing. She was executed on May 3, 1945, just 3 months before Japan surrendered. Her name appears in no official records. The Jade Phoenix brothel was demolished in the 1950s, but veterans of the Ghost Network know her story. She saved at least 20 pilots, and she died protecting the network that saved hundreds more. Zhang Meifang, only 19 when the war started, worked as a nurse at Shanghai General Hospital. The Japanese used the hospital to treat their wounded, which meant Japanese military police controlled access. Zhang had a Japanese-issued identification card that allowed her to move freely through checkpoints. She used this access to smuggle medical supplies to resistance forces and to treat wounded pilots in underground safe houses. Her nurse's bag, inspected perfunctorily at checkpoints, carried bandages, antibiotics, and surgical instruments into Japanese-occupied zones. She also carried something else: coded messages written on prescription pads that looked like ordinary medical notes. Zhang was part of a network of female medical professionals who turned hospitals and clinics into intelligence nodes. They documented which Japanese units were suffering casualties, indicating combat operations. They noted disease outbreaks that suggested poor sanitary conditions in Japanese camps. They treated Chinese civilians injured by Japanese forces, documenting atrocities for future war crimes tribunals. She survived the war and became a doctor. In a 1986 interview, she was asked if she'd been afraid. "Every single day," she admitted, "but fear is just a feeling. You feel it, acknowledge it, and do the work anyway. Those pilots needed help. People were suffering. Someone had to act. Why not me?" The most politically sensitive aspect of the Ghost Network was its relationship with Chinese Communist forces. During the war, the Chinese Communist Party controlled significant territory in northern and central China. The 8th Route Army, New 4th Army, and guerrilla units like the Dongjiang Column operated behind Japanese lines, conducting resistance operations. For American and British authorities, working with communists was ideologically uncomfortable, but it was also necessary. Communist forces controlled the territory where most pilots went down. They had the local knowledge, the fighters, and the motivation to help. Turning down their assistance meant leaving pilots to die or be captured. The solution was pragmatic: work with them operationally while maintaining political distance. BAAG coordinated with communist units through intermediaries,
usually Chinese agents who could operate in both nationalist and communist territories. Intelligence was shared selectively. Payment for rescues was made in supplies rather than currency. Weapons, ammunition, and medical supplies that communist forces desperately needed. The relationship was complicated by the fact that nationalist and communist forces were essentially in a frozen civil war. They weren't actively fighting each other while Japan occupied China, but they also weren't cooperating. Both sides understood that when Japan was defeated, they'd resume fighting for control of China. Both sides wanted American support for that eventual conflict. The Ghost Network navigated this political minefield by maintaining strict neutrality. Pilots rescued by communists were not debriefed about communist military capabilities or positions. Communist intelligence about Japanese forces was shared with American military planners, but not with nationalist forces who might use it against communists later. BAAG officers were explicitly instructed to never take sides in internal Chinese politics. This neutrality was tested repeatedly. In June 1944, a P-51 pilot was rescued by communist guerrillas of the new Fourth Army. Nationalist forces demanded that he be turned over to them for extraction. The communists refused, claiming the pilot was in their operational area. For 3 weeks, the pilot waited in a guerrilla camp while BAAG negotiated. Finally, Moon Chin flew a CNAC aircraft directly into communist territory, landing on a river sandbar with communist sentries guarding the perimeter, and extracted the pilot personally. Politics, said Moon later, had no place in rescue operations. Our job was getting pilots out, not picking sides in China's civil war. The communists saved Americans, the nationalists saved Americans. We worked with whoever could help. After the war, this cooperation became politically toxic. During the Chinese Civil War, 1945 to 1949, Americans who'd worked with communists were viewed with suspicion. During the McCarthy era in America, some BAAG officers and CNAC pilots faced accusations of communist sympathies simply because they'd coordinated with communist forces during rescue operations. The irony was bitter. Men who'd risked their lives to save American pilots were later suspected of disloyalty because they'd worked with the only people capable of conducting those rescues.
The final weeks of the war saw the Ghost Network operating at peak efficiency. By August 1945, they'd refined their methods through 3 years of trial and error. Rescue times had dropped from weeks to days. Survival rates for downed pilots had increased dramatically. The network had become a well-oiled machine. Then the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan announced surrender on August 15th. Suddenly, the war was over. But not immediately. In occupied China, Japanese forces didn't surrender instantly. Some units fought on, unaware of the surrender or refusing to accept it. Others maintained occupation of cities and military facilities, waiting for formal surrender ceremonies. The period between August 15th and September 2nd was chaotic and dangerous. BAAG and CNAC launched Operation Birdcage, an effort to locate and evacuate all Allied POWs from camps throughout occupied China before Japanese discipline collapsed entirely. Moon Chin and other CNAC pilots flew missions into airports technically still controlled by Japanese forces, landed, loaded prisoners, and departed. Some Japanese units cooperated. Others opened fire.
On August 19, 1945, Qin landed at Weizhen internment camp in Shandong province. The camp held 1,500 Allied civilians, missionaries, businessmen, and families who'd been interned since 1941. Among them was Eric Liddell, the Olympic champion whose story was told in Chariots of Fire. Liddell had died of a brain tumor in February 1945, just months before liberation. Qin's aircraft was the first sign many internees had that the war was over. They came running across the airfield, Qin remembered. Skeletal figures in rags, crying, laughing, some just standing there in shock. We loaded as many as we could, far more than the aircraft was rated for. On the flight to Xi'an, people were sitting in the aisles, standing in the cargo hold. Nobody cared. We were bringing them home. BAAG agents fanned out across occupied territory, making contact with resistance forces and confirming that all known downed pilots had been accounted for. They found 3 Americans who'd been hiding in rural villages for over a year, unaware of how close they were to rescue networks. They discovered 2 British officers who'd escaped from POW camps weeks before the surrender and were living with communist guerrillas. Everyone was brought out. The final accounting showed that of all American pilots shot down over China between 1942 and 1945, approximately 57% were rescued or escaped. Of those captured, about 40% survived Japanese POW camps. The overall survival rate, combining rescue, evasion, and POW survival, was approximately 68%. By comparison, pilots shot down over Germany had a survival rate of about 65%, combining rescue, evasion, and POW survival. The Ghost Network, operating with minimal resources in hostile territory, had achieved results comparable to formal military rescue operations in Europe. After the war, the U.S. government established compensation programs for various groups who'd helped American forces. Filipino guerrillas who'd fought against Japan received payments. French resistance members who'd helped downed pilots received awards and financial recognition. Even some European civilians who'd hidden Americans received compensation. The Chinese civilians who'd saved American lives received almost nothing. Part of this was political. By 1949, China had fallen to communist forces. The nationalist government had retreated to Taiwan. America's relationship with mainland China went from allied to hostile overnight. Paying compensation to people now living under communist rule was politically impossible during the Cold War. Part was bureaucratic. Many rescues had never been properly documented. Pilots who'd been rescued often didn't know the names of their rescuers. Villages that had hidden Americans had been destroyed in the war's final years. Records were scattered or lost. But mostly, it was indifference. The American public wanted to move on from the war. China's civil war seemed distant and complex, and there was an uncomfortable racism underlying it all. Chinese lives were simply valued less than European ones. In 1955, the U.S. Congress passed legislation authorizing payments to Chinese civilians who'd helped American forces. The amount authorized, $50 per rescue. Total amount distributed, approximately $28,000, covering roughly 560 individuals. This represented perhaps 10% of the actual number of Chinese who'd participated in rescue operations. Compare that to the French compensation. The U.S. government paid approximately $1.5 million to French citizens who'd helped downed pilots, covering roughly 3,000 individuals at an average of $500 per person. The message was clear. A Chinese life risked to save an American was worth 1/10 of a French life risked for the same purpose. Harold Watson, the Doolittle raider whose rescue cost Ma Eng-lin and his wife their lives, spent decades trying to get compensation for Ma's surviving daughter. He wrote to Congress, lobbied the State Department, and testified before various committees. He was told repeatedly that the payment limit had been reached, that additional compensation was impossible, that the matter was closed. In 1987, Watson established a private fund using his own money. He raised $15,000 from fellow Doolittle Raiders and Flying Tigers. He returned to China and personally delivered the money to families of Chinese who'd been killed helping Americans. It was a drop in the ocean, but it was something. "We owed them everything," Watson said in a 1990 interview 6 months before his death. "They gave their lives so we could live, and we paid them $50. $50. It's a national disgrace. These people were heroes, and we treated them like they were disposable."
Starting in the 1980s, as China opened to the West and veterans entered their final years, organized reunions began bringing rescuers and rescued together. These meetings were often the first time pilots learned the full story of their rescue. Who had helped them? What risks had been taken? What prices had been paid? In 1995, the Flying Tigers Association organized a reunion in Guilin. 23 American veterans attended, along with over 200 Chinese who'd participated in rescue operations. Many of the Chinese were elderly, survivors of decades of war, revolution, and the Cultural Revolution's chaos. Some had been imprisoned by communist authorities specifically because they'd helped Americans. The event organizer, retired Colonel Ed Rector, described it. "These old Chinese people would walk up to our guys, and there'd be this moment of recognition. The pilot would remember a face from 50 years ago, the farmer who'd hidden him, the soldier who'd guided him, the woman who'd fed him. And they'd just embrace and weep, all of them weeping, because they'd survived. Against all odds, they'd survived." One reunion involved Lieutenant Donald Kerr, the pilot rescued by the Danjiang Column Communist guerrillas, and Li Shi, the 14-year-old boy who'd found him in 1944. Li was now 65, a retired factory worker. He'd spent 3 years in prison during the Cultural Revolution because he'd admitted to helping Americans. He'd lost his job, his home, and his family had been persecuted. Kerr asked him, through a translator, if he regretted helping Americans given what it had cost him. Li's response was immediate. "Regret? No. I did the right thing. The Japanese were evil. You were fighting against evil. How could I regret standing against evil? The communists called it betrayal. I call it being human." The translator was crying too hard to continue for several minutes. Today, the physical remnants of the ghost network are mostly gone. The safe houses have been demolished or rebuilt beyond recognition. The airstrips CNAC used have become shopping malls or apartment complexes. The radio sets and code books have been lost to time. But in the mountains of Zhejiang province, Chinese villagers still find wreckage from the Doolittle raid. Pieces of aluminum from B-25 bombers scattered across hillsides, slowly being reclaimed by jungle. They bring these pieces to local museums, little shrines to the day when America came to their villages and their ancestors proved who they were. In Aihuang, where Ma Eng-lin was burned alive for helping Harold Watson, there's a small memorial. It was erected in 1985, paid for by donations from American veterans. The inscription is in both English and Chinese.
To those who gave everything for strangers, you are not forgotten. Every year on April 18th, the anniversary of the Doolittle raid, elderly Chinese gather at that memorial. Fewer each year. Soon, there will be none. The generation that witnessed the war is dying, taking their memories with them. In the United States, the story of the Ghost Network is barely known. Most Americans are unaware that civilian networks rescued hundreds of pilots. The emphasis in popular history has been on military rescues, on dramatic combat missions, on technological solutions. The messy reality of civilians improvising rescue operations under occupation doesn't fit neat narratives. But among the pilot community, the story is remembered. The Flying Tigers Association maintains records of every rescue. The Doolittle Raiders, before the last of them passed away, documented who saved them and how. These records exist in archives, waiting for historians to fully tell the story. When all the records are compiled, declassified, and analyzed, the Ghost Network's impact becomes clear. Over 400 Allied pilots and aircrew rescued from Japanese-occupied China. Approximately 80% of these rescues involved civilian networks, missionaries, businessmen, CNAC pilots, or Chinese civilians. The remaining 20% were military-conducted rescues or successful evasions without assistance. An estimated 1,200 to 1,500 Chinese civilians died directly because of their involvement in rescue operations. This includes those executed by the Japanese, those killed in crossfire, and those who died from complications after the war, persecution during the Civil War, punishment during the Cultural Revolution. If the broader Japanese retaliation operations are included, the Zhijiangxi campaign and similar punitive actions, the death toll reaches 250,000 to 300,000 Chinese civilians killed in retaliation for areas helping American pilots. The intelligence gathered by the Ghost Network contributed to approximately 40% of actionable intelligence used by the 14th Air Force for target selection, detailed order of battle information that shaped Allied strategy in the China theater, weather data that improved bomber mission success rates by an estimated 25%, and early warning of Japanese operations that saved countless Chinese civilian and military lives. The economic cost of running the network was remarkably low. BAAG operated on an annual budget of approximately $500,000 in 1940s dollars, most of it spent on bribes, supplies for safe houses, and payments to Chinese agents. CNAC's rescue operations were essentially cost-free, conducted during routine flights with minimal additional expense. Compare this to military rescue operations. The Air Rescue Service, established late in the war, spent an estimated $50 million annually on dedicated rescue aircraft, trained personnel, and support operations. They rescued approximately 300 pilots in the Pacific Theater, a success rate lower than the civilian Ghost Network. The conclusion is inescapable. Civilians, improvising with minimal resources, achieved results that military planners couldn't match despite vastly greater budgets and official support.
In 2005, the last major reunion of Ghost Network survivors was held in San Francisco. Only 6 American pilots were healthy enough to attend. Perhaps 30 Chinese rescuers made the trip, most now in their 80s or 90s. The Chinese government, aware of the event's political sensitivity, neither endorsed nor opposed it. They simply pretended it wasn't happening. During a panel discussion, a college student asked a question that silenced the room. Knowing what you know now, that 250,000 Chinese would die because Japan retaliated for helping you, would you still want them to rescue you? The pilots struggled with the answer. Several broke down. Finally, Harold Watson, then 93, 1 year before his death, spoke.
That question has haunted me for 60 years. Every day I think about Ma Yinglin and his wife. They saved me and they died because of it. Was my life worth theirs? I don't know. I can't know. But I know this. They made a choice. They chose to help even knowing the risks. Who am I to dishonor that choice by wishing they hadn't made it? The evil wasn't them helping me. The evil was the Japanese killing them for it. Don't put the moral burden on the victims. They were heroes. Every single one of them. They stood against evil when they could have stayed silent. They saved strangers when they could have looked away. They chose humanity over safety. I've tried to live a life worthy of their sacrifice. I've tried to honor their memory. But worthy? How do you become worthy of someone dying for you? You can't. You just try. Every day, you try. The room was silent except for the sound of crying. The Chinese rescuers, the American pilots, the translator, the student who'd asked the question. Everyone. That silence held more truth about the Ghost Network than any official history could capture. William Langhorne Bond, the stubborn CNAC manager who'd refused to evacuate Hong Kong, survived the war. He continued running CNAC until the communist victory in 1949, then returned to America. He died in 1969, largely forgotten, except for the pilots he'd helped save. Moon Chin flew commercially until 1952, when CNAC's remnant operations finally ceased. He retired to San Francisco, where he opened a small restaurant. He rarely spoke about the war until the 1980s, when researchers tracked him down. His memoir, Moon Chin's War, was published posthumously in 1994. It remains the best first-hand account of CNAC's role in the Ghost Network. Lindsay Ride returned to his position at the University of Hong Kong after the war. He was knighted in 1952 for his service with BAAG. He never fully documented BAAG's operations, believing that revealing his agents' identities would endanger them under communist rule. He died in 1977, taking many secrets with him. Father Wendelin Dunker survived the war, but was expelled from China in 1951 when the communist government closed foreign missions. He spent his final years at a Franciscan monastery in Wisconsin, teaching Latin and writing unpublished memoirs about his time in China. He died in 1972. His manuscripts, discovered in a monastery archive in 2003, provided crucial details about the Doolittle Raid rescues. Kei Chin Ma, the translator who spied from inside Japanese headquarters, emigrated to Canada in 1949. She worked as a translator at the United Nations for 20 years. She revealed her wartime activities only in 1987, when BAAG records were finally declassified. She received the British Empire Medal in a ceremony at Hong Kong's Government House. She died in 1992, honored, but not celebrated. Her story still too sensitive for mainstream recognition. Li Shi, the 14-year-old boy who found Donald Kerr, lived a hard life after the war. He was imprisoned during the Cultural Revolution, released, and worked in a factory until retirement. In 1995, the Flying Tigers Association brought him to America. He met Kerr, the pilot he'd rescued 50 years earlier. The two men stayed in contact until Lee's death in 2008. At Lee's request, he was buried wearing a leather flight jacket Kerr had given him, a Flying Tigers jacket with a bloodshed sewn inside. "I am an American. Please help me." The Dongjiang columned guerrillas who rescued so many pilots were disbanded after the war. Their members scattered into the New People's Liberation Army. Many were later purged during various political campaigns for having had too much contact with foreigners.
Their role in rescuing Americans was officially downplayed because it complicated the narrative of American imperialism that dominated communist rhetoric during the Cold War. In 2005, the Chinese government finally acknowledged the guerrillas' rescue operations, dedicating a museum in Shenzhen to the Dongjiang column's wartime activities. A single room, poorly lit and rarely visited, displays photographs of rescued pilots and testimonials from American veterans. It's not much, but it's something.
The Ghost Network proved something that military planners and political leaders often forget. Ordinary people, when faced with extraordinary evil, can choose to be extraordinary. They weren't trained intelligence agents or military rescue specialists. They were airline pilots and missionaries, oil company engineers and tea traders, farmers and factory workers, nurses and brothel owners. They had no special skills beyond courage, compassion, and a willingness to risk everything for strangers. They operated under cover stories because they had to, because the Japanese would kill them if discovered, because their work required secrecy, because survival demanded deception. The banana traders and oil engineers, the missionaries and medical workers, the airline pilots flying routine routes, all of them hiding truth behind mundane business activities. But the cover stories weren't the point. The rescues were the point. The 400 pilots who lived because Chinese civilians gave them shelter. The families who shared their food with strangers even as they starved. The guerrilla fighters who risked their lives guiding Americans through Japanese lines. The women who smuggled messages past Kempeitai checkpoints. The children who served as lookouts and couriers. The cost was devastating. 250,000 dead, entire villages destroyed, families murdered for showing compassion. And after the war, barely any recognition, minimal compensation, and decades of political sensitivity that kept the story buried. Yet if you asked the survivors, the Chinese rescuers who lived through it all, most would say they'd do it again. Because when you see someone in need, you help. Because when you face evil, you resist. Because that's what it means to be human. The P-47 Thunderbolt brought the thunder of American industrial might to European skies. The Ghost Network brought something different to China. The quiet thunder of ordinary people choosing courage over safety, compassion over survival, humanity over fear. One kind of thunder came from synchronized Browning machine guns at 30,000 feet. The other came from a farmer's heart at ground level, deciding that a stranger's life was worth risking everything. History remembers the first kind of thunder. It echoes in books and documentaries, in museums and memorials. The second kind of thunder, quieter but no less powerful, has been largely forgotten. Until now. This is the story of the Ghost Network. The American expatriates who stayed when they should have left. The Chinese civilians who helped when silence would have been safer. The airline pilots who flew rescue missions disguised as mail runs. The missionaries who traded Bibles for radio codes. The women who turned brothels into safe houses. The children who became the eyes and ears of resistance. They built an underground railroad through occupied China. They outsmarted an empire using cover stories and courage. They saved lives the military couldn't reach, and they paid for it with blood and sacrifice that America has never adequately acknowledged. Harold Watson's final words, spoken at the 2005 reunion, echo across the decades. They chose humanity over safety. They saved strangers when they could have looked away. That choice, made by thousands of Chinese civilians, American expatriates, and everyone who touched the Ghost Network, is
the real story. Not the cover stories, not the business operations or the missionary work or the airline routes. The choice. The choice to help. The choice to resist. The choice to be better than the circumstances demanded. That thunder still echoes in the mountains of Zhejiang, where aluminum fragments rust in the jungle, in the archives where coded messages wait to be read, in the memories of aging veterans who remember faces from 70 years ago. The Ghost Network saved 400 pilots, but it taught the world something more important, that ordinary people, armed nothing but courage and compassion, can achieve the extraordinary. The Japanese laughed at the idea that civilians could disrupt their empire. They stopped laughing when they realized those civilians had built something their military intelligence couldn't penetrate, their competency couldn't break, and their military power couldn't stop. In August 1945, as Japan surrendered and Allied forces moved into occupied China, Japanese intelligence officers were ordered to destroy their files. Documents were burned by the thousands, but some survived, captured by advancing Allied forces before they could be destroyed. Among these documents was a Japanese Army intelligence assessment dated March 1945, 5 months before surrender. The report, translated and declassified in 1978, makes for remarkable reading. Quote, "The Allied rescue network operating in occupied China represents our most significant intelligence failure of the war. Despite extensive counter-intelligence operations, torture of captured suspects, collective punishment of suspect villages, and infiltration attempts, we have been unable to significantly disrupt the network's operations. The network appears to be multi-layered, with cells operating independently. Captured agents reveal nothing under interrogation, either through genuine ignorance of the larger organization or through extraordinary resistance to questioning. Chinese civilians continue to assist downed Allied pilots despite witnessing the consequences. Most significantly, the network has penetrated our own administration. We have documented cases of intelligence leaks from our headquarters, suggesting the presence of agents in positions of trust. We cannot determine the extent of this penetration. Assessment: the rescue network represents a fundamental failure to control the occupied population. It demonstrates that military occupation cannot succeed without genuine cooperation from civilian population. Chinese civilians have chosen resistance over collaboration, sacrifice over safety. This suggests our position in China is untenable regardless of military situation. That report, written by a Japanese intelligence officer 5 months before surrender, understood what many post-war historians missed. The Ghost Network's success wasn't just about rescuing pilots. It was about resistance, about proving that occupation could never be complete, that collaboration could never be assumed, that some things couldn't be conquered by military force alone. Every pilot rescued was a small tactical victory, but the existence of the network itself was a strategic defeat for Japan. It demonstrated that Chinese civilians, despite brutal occupation, despite collective punishment, despite every reason to stay silent, chose to resist.
For the pilots rescued by the Ghost Network, the experience fundamentally changed them. Many returned to combat with a new understanding of what they were fighting for. Lieutenant Robert Scott, rescued by communist guerrillas in October 1943 after his P-40 was shot down, wrote in his journal, "I came to China thinking this was a war between governments and armies. I was wrong. This is a war between systems of belief. The Japanese believe in domination through terror.
The Chinese believe in resistance through sacrifice. I know which side represents humanity's future. Scott flew 72 more missions before the war ended. He survived and became a commercial pilot. But he never forgot the guerrilla fighters who'd protected him for 3 weeks. In the 1970s, when relations between the U.S. and China began to normalize, Scott was among the first American veterans to return. He spent 2 weeks trying to find the guerrilla unit that had saved him. He never succeeded. The Cultural Revolution had scattered survivors and destroyed records. But he left a donation of $10,000 with local officials, asking that it be used to help the families of resistance fighters. Whether it ever reached them is unknown. Captain James Howard, rescued by BAAG after being shot down in January 1945, had a different experience. He was hidden in Shanghai for 6 weeks, moving through safe houses operated by the underground network. He witnessed Japanese brutality firsthand. Random executions of Chinese civilians, torture of suspects, the grinding cruelty of occupation. I'd been fighting the Japanese for 2 years, Howard recalled in a 1989 interview. I'd shot down their planes, bombed their positions, killed their soldiers. But until Shanghai, I didn't really understand what we were fighting against. The occupation wasn't just military, it was systematic dehumanization. The Japanese treated Chinese civilians like they were subhuman. The people who saved me were risking torture and death, not just for themselves, but for their entire families, and they did it anyway. That's courage on a level I'd never imagined. Howard returned to combat flying with a fury that bordered on recklessness. He shot down 6 Japanese aircraft in the war's final 3 months. After the war, he testified at the Tokyo war crimes trials, providing first-hand testimony about Japanese atrocities in Shanghai. His testimony helped convict 3 Japanese officers of war crimes. In 1990, the Flying Tigers Association established the China Relief Fund, a private charity dedicated to helping Chinese civilians who'd assisted American forces during the war. The fund raised approximately $500,000 in its first 5 years, distributed to verified rescuers and their families. But finding recipients proved nearly impossible. Many rescuers had died, many others had been lost in the chaos of civil war and revolution, and many who survived were afraid to identify themselves, afraid of political complications, afraid of attention, afraid that acknowledging help to Americans might cause problems. The fund's administrators eventually shifted strategy. Instead of direct payments, they funded schools in villages that had hidden Americans, medical clinics in areas where resistance operations had occurred, and scholarships for descendants of known rescuers. It wasn't the same as direct compensation, but it was something. Harold Watson personally funded the education of Ma Ang-lin's granddaughter, the daughter of the woman who'd witnessed her grandparents' execution. She attended university in Beijing, became a teacher, and never knew who'd paid her tuition until Watson died and his lawyer revealed the arrangement. She wept when she learned. She'd been telling her students about her grandparents for years, teaching young Chinese about sacrifice and courage. She never knew an American was listening, in his own way. The U.S. Air Force maintains records of the Ghost Network at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama. The files are thin. Most operations were never properly documented, and civilian networks didn't generate the paperwork military operations produced. But the essential facts are there. Who was rescued, when, and by whom when that information is known. The files reveal patterns that historians had missed. The rescue success rate improved dramatically over the war's course. In 1942, only about 40% of downed pilots in occupied China were rescued. By 1945, that rate had climbed to over 70%. The network learned, adapted,
and improved. The files also reveal the racial dynamics nobody wanted to discuss. White American pilots were prioritized for rescue over Chinese pilots flying for American units. Chinese-American pilots occupied an uncomfortable middle ground, rescued because they were American, but sometimes treated with suspicion because they were Chinese. Lieutenant Colonel James Wang, a Chinese-American pilot with the 14th Air Force, was shot down in April 1945. He was rescued by communist guerrillas who initially suspected he was a Japanese agent because of his Asian features. Only when he showed his blood chit and spoke English did they accept he was American. Wang survived and later wrote about the experience. "I was fighting for a country that sometimes didn't seem I belonged to it. The Chinese who saved me were more certain of my American identity than some Americans were."
Military historians studying the Ghost Network have drawn various conclusions. Some focus on intelligence gathering techniques. Others analyze rescue logistics. A few examine the network as a model for resistance operations in occupied territory. But the most important lesson isn't tactical or strategic. It's human. The Ghost Network succeeded because ordinary people made extraordinary choices. They didn't have special training or resources. They didn't have government backing or official authority. They had only their courage, their compassion, and their willingness to risk everything. The missionaries who traded Bibles for radio codes weren't intelligence professionals. They were people of faith who believed protecting life was more important than protecting themselves. The CNAC pilots who flew rescue missions weren't military heroes. They were civilian aviators who believed some things were worth risking your neck for. The Chinese farmers who hid Americans weren't soldiers. They were ordinary people who saw someone in need and helped. The women who smuggled messages and tended wounded pilots weren't trained agents. They were nurses, teachers, and brothel owners who used whatever resources they had to resist evil. This is the network's real legacy, proof that you don't need to be special to do something extraordinary. You just need to choose courage over safety, compassion over indifference, action over paralysis. In 2018, a researcher at the Chinese University of Hong Kong discovered a cache of documents that had somehow survived the Cultural Revolution. Among them were letters written by Chinese civilians involved in rescue operations. Letters never sent, kept as personal records, hidden for decades. One letter, dated August 10, 1945, 5 days before Japan's surrender, was written by a farmer named Chan Wei-gao. He'd hidden 2 American pilots in July 1945. The letter was addressed to his son, fighting with communist forces somewhere in northern China. "My son, I do not know if you will ever read this letter. I do not know if I will survive to see you again. But I want you to know what I have done, so you will understand if anything happens. Last month, 2 American pilots crashed near our village. The Japanese are searching for them. I have hidden them in the storage cellar. I give them food from our own mouths. Your mother tends their wounds. Your sister watches for Japanese patrols. You might ask why we risk our family for strangers. The answer is simple. Because it is right. Because someone must stand against evil. Because if we all choose safety over righteousness, then evil has already won. The Japanese have occupied our country for 8 years. They have killed millions of our people. They have tried to break our spirit through terror, but they cannot break what they cannot reach. Our humanity, our compassion, our willingness to help others even at cost to ourselves. Every American we save is a victory not just of tactics, but of spirit. It proves we are not defeated, not conquered, not broken.
It proves we remain human even when surrounded by inhumanity. If I die for this choice, I die knowing I stood for something larger than myself. I die knowing I chose right over safe. I die knowing that when my moment came, I did not fail. Be safe, my son. Fight bravely. And remember always, being human means helping others, even when, especially when, it costs us everything. Jianwei Guo survived the war. His letter was found among his effects when he died in 1992. His son, who received the letter after his father's death, donated it to the museum at Chongqing. It hangs there today, yellowed and fragile, a testament to the choice thousands made. The P-47 Thunderbolts that dominated European skies are mostly gone now. A few survive in museums, polished and preserved, monuments to American industrial power and military might. Their thunder silenced decades ago. But the thunder of the Ghost Network, the quiet thunder of ordinary people choosing extraordinary courage, still echoes. In the stories veterans tell their grandchildren, in the memorials scattered across China, in the archives where letters wait to be read, in the mountains where aluminum fragments rust, silent witnesses to the day Americans fell from the sky and strangers became saviors. That thunder doesn't come from synchronized machine guns or radial engines. It comes from something deeper, the sound of a farmer's door opening to shelter a stranger, the sound of a pilot's radio crackling with coordinates for a rescue, the sound of a woman's heels clicking past Japanese guards, carrying messages that would save lives, the sound of children running through occupied streets, serving as the network's eyes and ears. This is the thunder that matters, not the thunder of weapons, but the thunder of choices, not the thunder of destruction, but the thunder of compassion. The Ghost Network proved that the most powerful weapon in war isn't always the biggest gun or the fastest plane. Sometimes it's something simpler. Ordinary people who refuse to be ordinary when it matters most. 400 pilots came home because of them. 250,000 Chinese civilians died because of the Japanese response. The mathematics of that exchange will haunt history forever. But the choice those Chinese civilians made to help despite knowing the risks represents humanity at its best. They were farmers and fighters, missionaries and merchants, pilots and prostitutes, nurses and guerrillas. They were the Ghost Network. They operated undercover stories because they had to. They rescued pilots because they could. They resisted occupation because they chose to. And when Japanese officers asked them why risk everything for strangers? Why sacrifice your family for foreigners? Why choose death over safety? Their answer was always the same. Because it was right. That's the sound that echoes across 75 years, not the thunder of engines or guns, but the thunder of that simple truth. Because it was right. The Ghost Network heard that thunder, and they answered it.